I don't have to. Oh, yeah, it works.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
For me. I can't put my arm up.
Yeah, I'm just saying. You don't have to be your good hand, why does it have to be you?
So this doesn't. You know, it's got laws, if you fly in this situation, we're all going right-handed, only some of us are good enough to be clean.
So, all right, guys. As most of you guys know, I'm Jerry. I guess we can get started with the obvious, as Mark eloquently stated. I'm going to be going over unit testing with Visual Studio 2012. Yeah, with Microsoft Fakes framework as the testing tool of choice. But we'll get into that. You know, just for a little bit about myself. I'm doing both. I have my notes here. I have this here. It's been a lot easier. I hope that comments out. So just a little bit about myself. Don't worry about the pictures. They're just visually pleasing. I like that particular bike. Does anyone here ride besides Brian? Anyone else? No?
Yeah, my license.
Oh yeah? Something to zoom on? I
need something with a motor.
I had a 600. I had a CBR 600 that I used to ride on. Not soon before I got this job. But I don't know. It gets kind of jaded, I guess.
I had one for less than a week, crashed it.
Yeah. Oof. I actually crashed mine, not to get too sidetracked, but I actually crashed mine like the first week I had it.
Did you?
I laid it down. But I didn't crash it to wreck it. I just laid it down. Got the fairings nice and scratched out, with a brand new bike. It was disheartening. It was so embarrassing too, because it was like right next to an entrance. So yeah, it kind of defeated the purpose of looking cool with a bike. Nonetheless, as far as my professional background, I'm a graduate from West Florida. Graduated with a degree in mathematics, computer science as my minor. So I'm fairly new to programming. I've been programming for over a year now. So nonetheless, just to give a further background on myself, I'm also a certified solutions developer in .NET 4.5, and I'm a self-proclaimed technologist. Just simply, I like technology. I love sports. I love competitive sports. So I guess I'm a sports center junkie. I don't get much time to watch sports now since I've been working, but nonetheless, still love sports. Love to talk about it. Love to play it. Played flag football this past year. Actually, for the past couple of years, I've been playing flag football just to kind of stay active. Yeah.
What's your name from college?
My college team has always been Virginia Tech. They haven't been doing so well. I've been keeping up with Florida State. As far as this year, I like Alabama as well. I really just become a really good fan of good football. Who's ever playing good football or good sport, technically sound, I'm a fan of that. Not necessarily the team, because I guess parts are so interchangeable now. Someone your favorite player might never this team, or so on and so forth. Nonetheless, but I guess my favorite professional football team is Buffalo Bills, and I would probably root for anything New York, as most people would. That's from a particular area.
Not the Buffalo Army.
Not the Buffalo. I love the Buffalo
They're
Sabres.
so bad. They've won less than 10 years.
Yeah. Well, I love the Buffalo Sabres. Their hometown. We were good for some time.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Just to get back on track. Here's a brief overview of what I'm going to be covering today. And at the end of this presentation, I hope that we can walk away with a better understanding of what unit tests are, how they can benefit us in developing awesome software solutions, and what frameworks are out there that can assist us, in accomplishing this goal. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to dive into the framework of choice that I'm going to be getting into is the FAKES framework. I'm going to write some code as well, so you guys bear with me with that. I'm going to write it all in front of you, so that'll be cool. And my main objective is to just provide us with some additional tools that we can add to our stack, as developers. I don't want to get into I guess as Terry stated earlier in our SE meeting, I don't want to get into the religious aspects of unit testing and test-driven development and these things. I kind of want to keep it neutral, that we can grab a couple things out of this and be able to use them even starting tomorrow, hopefully. I mean, that's the path that I decided to go with, because when I first started getting into this, it was a big thing. So many different views, so many different philosophies, so many different paradigms, that I didn't necessarily know how I was going to approach it. So I approached it with everything at first. Then I kind of narrowed it down to see what would be most useful, at the end of the day for us, and also for myself. The biggest thing about volunteering and doing this for myself was volunteering and doing this first and foremost is for myself, just to kind of put some pressure on myself to learn new aspects of the technology, to become a better developer, and as cliche as it may sound, be a contributing member to our team. So first and foremost, what is a unit test? Does anyone here have a concept of what unit testing is?
Is that where you're kind of testing just a simple piece of your code? Might be a class, be a method within that class, as opposed to the program itself. You're kind of breaking it down into smaller chunks?
Right. So what he said basically is what a unit test is. Well, we'll get there. But let's start off by saying, so what isn't a unit test? And I'm gonna have a little video for you guys to kind of get an idea of what a unit test is not. They go by the name of integration tests.
Is this a home movie?
I hope not. We were just talking about that, actually. So let's try to keep it general.
It's not a home movie, I'm okay.
Part-time job that is constructive to one that isn't.
Excuse me. Can I? No speakers.
You know what to do, Rocky? You have any control?
So just to give you an overview of the video.
How many times do you actually
Second one, how you gonna get
Or plug in, make sure it's plugged in, the hardware is plugged in.
Time to get right. It saves time because the Ryan
It's not going through it.
specialize in building bridges as well as not building them.
We haven't changed the audio, so.
I think the recording was messing it up.
But just to give you guys an overview of the video, so you know what to expect. Essentially, what these guys did here, they built a bridge. And one thing that I've noticed becoming a software engineer is that our discipline is it's exactly the same as any engineering discipline. We should take it with the same approach, with the same discipline, with the same concern. When we're building objects. Whether you're a design guy or a back end guy, a front end guy or a back end guy. The objects we create virtual structures. Just like an Yeah, growing up in Niagara Falls, New York, we get a lot of the Canadian channels by default.
We got the American channel.
What do you know?
So, we get into that English, British kind of humor. I'm sure you probably grew up on as well. I guess to some degree, not to single you out though. Nonetheless, that there at best is what we would call integration testing. And essentially, since I've worked here, that's basically what we do. We create a white box of sort, and we test out the functionality or some functionality of the system or the method that we just implemented. Why would I consider that an integration test? Because like I touched on earlier, the strength of the wind has not been taken into account. That's a variable that's out of their control during that particular test. The temperature outside is out of their control. That's something that they have to, while testing that, they can't really measure that variable. They can't test it in specific scenarios. What if it's 0 below? What if, what is this thing that everyone's big on right now? Global warming and the glaciers, happening and so on and so forth. Those are certain things that these particular engineers or these particular QA guys, whatever their position, they can't take those things into account, right? So it's an integrated test. It's dependent upon things that's out of our control, and that's what unit tests That's what the FAKES framework, for instance. That's what it's designed to kind of give us control over each variable in our system, or as we would say in the software world, each dependency. Each class that our client, or rather our calling class, is dependent upon to do its job. Messed up slide. Nonetheless.
This one was tested.
Yeah.
This is what happens when you don't test.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, no, it's a regression thing, right? I made a change in the future and it messed up some stuff in the past. Unit testing helps with regression as well. But essentially, we started off, what is a unit test? So a unit test is a method that invokes a unit of code and checks the correctness of that code with some assumptions afterwards. With that being said, what is a unit of code? Well, a unit of code is any logical code. As Mark touched on there, is his understanding of a unit code with a class or a method. In essence, it even gets smaller than that. So an if statement is a unit of code. A for loop is a unit of code. Again, any logical code or logical code as a piece of code that has any type of logic in it, that has any type of decision-making prowess. So in other words, to bunch all of that up, a unit test is simply a method that invokes any piece of code that has some sort of logic in it and checks for the correctness of our assumptions. So with the unit test, I said I didn't want to get into the religion of it and all of that too much, but the unit testing paradigm, I guess when you're approaching a unit test, essentially, the first thing we want to do is understand the intent of the requirement. And I can say as a young developer, a lot of times I can get tasks, but I don't really understand the intent of the class. I understand what it has to do, but I don't know why it's doing what it's doing. So understanding the intent of the requirement is very important. Secondly, I want to write a test that asserts that intent that I want to happen. And lastly, I want to write my production code to meet that intent. And if you have any questions, let me know if that isn't clear. I have a bad habit of elaborating when I don't need to. I guess the big question is, how can unit tests help us? Well, first and foremost, they help us meet many of the rules of success that we have in place here at BitWizard, to deliver awesome software solutions. A little bit of marketing there. Yeah. But with that being said, they allow us to take care of the customer by building quality into our code, right? So each unit test that we make, it essentially says this unit of code works, and this is my evidence that it works. By definition, unit tests cover the details of our software. They allow us to be thorough by ensuring that we understand not only the requirement, but also its intent, what it's supposed to do. They also allow us to be consistent in design. One thing I hear over and over again, or what I've read over and over again while researching this, was that the use of implementing unit tests into into how we develop software, it forces you to write better code that meets industry standards in software design, and you'll sort of see that as we go along. So as with anything, no great idea or no great tool is any good if the tool itself is no good, or if you're using it wrong, right? A hammer is as great as it is. If you're using it wrong, it's not going to do. If you're using it to screw in bolts, you're going to find it's not a really good tool, And that doesn't mean throw away the hammer. It means learn how to use the tool. Nonetheless, here are some of the properties of a good unit test. As you can see there, they're automated and repeatable. Has anyone here in any of your experience, have you had to deal with unit tests? Have you been forced to write unit tests? I know I spoke with Terry. Terry said it. What was you as well?
JavaScript test.
Yeah. What has been your I guess your experience as far as how other developers have felt, when they say, hey, you got to start implementing unit tests, or so on and so forth.
I think what a lot of people hear testing today, it's like a big elephant that nobody wants to touch. It's a scary monster. That's the way I felt before.
Yeah.
I started.
And why do you think people feel that way?
It sounds hard.
It sounds hard.
You probably don't want your code to work.
Right. I see. That's being honest. Anyone else? That's it. You guys that have used it.
Something else you gotta learn.
Yeah, something else you gotta learn. Yeah. The biggest thing that I found with unit tests, it was a shift in how you develop. It was, if I may, a cultural shift, so to speak. Because I know starting off in college and what have you, I'm given a task and I just want to get right in the code and go at it, make it work. Keep doing it until it builds. Until you have no more squiggly lines if you're using Visual Studio. So Visual Studio has helped my life out a lot, because in college we had the programming and console applications, so you never really knew where the bugs were. You just kind of had to hack it away. But nonetheless, as you can see here, again, getting back on track, the properties of a good unit test is that they're easily implemented. So if you're building a unit test and it's hard, then it's not good, quite frankly. Another great feature is that it can be ran for the life of the system. We talked about regression testing. That's one of the benefits of a good unit test, is that when new features break old features, it lets us know, hey, your old feature is broke because of this new feature. And things start becoming clear, as I begin to dive into some of this. Touching on the last two, they should be readable by all of our developers. So obviously from our seniors to our juniors, and also they're fast. excuse me. In other words, as I mentioned in addition to, like I mentioned on before, good unit test promotes solid object-oriented design. Anybody here familiar with the SOLID acronym? No? Okay. So essentially, this is the SOLID acronym. It's been around for some years, 1987, roughly. So essentially, look, I got some text cut down here. So essentially, it states that every class should have single responsibility. They should use the open and close principle, which basically says every class should be open for extension methods, but they should be closed for any type of modification. The list cost substitution principle, also referred to as the design by contract principle. If anyone's familiar with that, it basically says that that our classes should be designed in such a way that it expects only the interface implementations of an object. Does that make any sense? Is that a vague term?
It's a little bit.
A little vague? Yeah, you don't count. I don't think you count. Yeah. But nonetheless, again, like I said, it'll make more sense once we dive into code. The I in SOLID stands for interface segregation, the interface segregation principle, which is an extension of the previous rule that says no calling class, no class that's making a call, a method call to, or rather, no class that needs a dependency, that's instantiating another object, should have to depend on a property of that class that it's not using. What's a good example of that? For instance, if I have an employee, and that employee has some getters or some properties that has the first name, that has the last name, that has its ID, but my calling class only needs the first and last name, then I want to implement that calling class in such a way to where it's not forced to use the ID. And you will see that that's done by using interfaces or the rules previous to it, or why the name is coined the way it is. The D that's being cut off here, it stands for the dependency injection principle. And you'll see there's a recurring theme here. It's basically saying use interfaces. Use interfaces. Don't use concrete implementations. Don't new objects. Don't instantiate new objects within the calling class. Use an interface instead. All right, so going back to unit testing, what tools are available to us? Now, there's tons of tools out there, tons of frameworks. Here's just a few of them that I touched on. I started off looking into the in-unit framework. There's NMOX, and obviously the N stands for net, or it's a .NET implementation. There's JUnit for JavaScript.
GUnit for life.
GUnit all day. 50 Cent. Yeah. I'm sorry, I was thinking of a 50 Cent reference. I have no 50 Cent references. Not today.
Come on, man, it's your birthday.
There it is. That's the one I was looking for. Yeah, that's it. But obviously the one that we're going to be focusing on today, the unit testing framework that we're going to be focusing on is Microsoft Fake's framework. in .NET 4.5. Essentially, as you can see there by definition, it's an isolation framework. Touching back on the video that we saw there, where we saw that there were things out of our control. What this does is this isolates the code in such a way that allows us only to focus on that system, that method, or class, known as a system, the system that's under test. It allows us just to focus on that and control all of the outside factors, or I guess its dependencies. And they go by the names of stubs and shims. But before we can do any type of testing, that the main class that we use here is the assert class. And as it sort of hints at, it's an assertion. You're making an assertion. You're saying that I expect this to happen. So on and so forth. And here's some of its method calls. So I can test whether two objects are equal or not, whether they're the same, whether if I have two employees or if I have an employee in an aircraft, that'll tell us whether or not. Obviously, it's going to tell us the opposite as well. They're not the same. Whether it's of a specific instance of an object, the thing in which we're asserting, whether or not it's false, true, or if it's null. And again, touching back on that, because this is what we're going to be focused on, stubs and shims. So what are stubs? What are shims? A stub is a controllable replacement for for existing dependencies in our system. We use them to get around the problem of external dependencies. The thing about stubs is that they require solid object-oriented design. They require the use of interfaces and not concrete implementations. And everyone knows what I mean when I say concrete implementation. Well, the developer, software guy. Yeah. Essentially what a concrete implementation is, and like I said, these things have become more clear as I begin to dive into some code. But essentially what a concrete implementation is that right within my calling class, I'm instantiating that object. That concrete object, that object, all of its properties, all of its methods and its functions, and what have you. Moving on. So shims are for dealing with concrete implementation. We use shims because they don't require our code to be designed in a certain kind of way. So essentially we use shims for a lot of what we call legacy code. And legacy code is simply, I worked in pilot, for the first 8 months that I worked here, and that code had started around 2005. I saw some files in there. Yeah, some of it. That would what I would call that's what's known as legacy code, just code that's already been implemented, pushed out into production, so on and so forth. Legacy, old stuff. So when I get old, I want to be called legacy. I think it sounds a lot more eloquent.
What is that? Legacy J?
Huh?
Legacy J?
Legacy J. And the difference there, without reading aloud and reading aloud at the same time, the difference is, again, stubs are used when we have loosely coupled software designs. Shims are used when we don't, simply put. So again, shims are great for testing legacy code, and that's basically a diagram of what that looks like. So it's not too confusing.
So stubs versus shim, would that change the way maybe you would test like an embedded system versus Does that make sense, or does that not apply here?
I'm not familiar with that line of programming, embedded systems and so on. Could anyone here answer that?
Like I'm thinking with an embedded system that you have known variables, right? Is that not true? Whereas if you had like an integrated system with different type of calls and things you get back.
I don't know, that's a good theory though.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good thought.
I would assume if, like you said,
Embedded systems developers in this room.
yeah.
So, that gets into very specific, very targeted, concrete implementations, which is where you have a thought, and past that, interface and object oriented is becoming a part of that as well. Matter of fact, embedded chips and stuff are using multiple languages in the modern 4GL languages to implement instead of the old EEPROM for you do binary bits on and bits off. So you're running Java code with a lot of things in the chip.
Oh no, it's fine. So obviously this was a joke. This is more like what we're looking at here. So a stub dependency is something that's going to be injected. It's going to be injected into our system under test, or our method under test, right there at design time. So the use of this design pattern, which is the dependency injection pattern, we inject our dependencies into, and then we use this also. I see this also in our code. And then we implement the methods there, as opposed to, this is what I call a concrete class, newing it up right there within the method, as opposed to here. So in this instance, this call is made here, as opposed to here, sort of like. And those are different between the two. As you can see there, it obviously shows us that, this has to be designed in such a way to make that work, and that doesn't. Again, there's a never. So let's kind of dive into some code here. This should be fun. What? Oh. This changes everything. Does this have visual studio on it? Huh? Oh, it doesn't.
You can remote it to your study.
Our systems are down.
Fail.
Who engineers?
Tyler, you're up.
Who has the red shirt?
Remote it to Einstein.
Einstein?
Yep.
Can you do it for me?
He died a while ago.
Why do you think they go with computer?
Yeah. It's awesome. Oh Lord, do we have to?
C sharp, F sharp.
They've never what? What?
Yeah, it's gonna take 5 minutes.
Does it? Is there anybody else we should remote into then?
Joaquin's computer set up.
Marquin's?
Joaquin's computer has Visual Studios. You know, like Dave's computers, that's just what we use. You're gonna get out of it. You're remote TV.
What's that? Dave's VM? Which one? LaForge is Joaquin now.
Yeah, you don't have to take care of it.
What's Dave's? Dave,
It's Miguel. Dave, what's the VM you use? What's the name of the VM that you
You just need to be able to, where you're writing yourself, you plug this in, and then we will do your.
it'll kill the recording.
Why have to wait?
He has a link. Mine's Steve. What you do there? Come on, man.
I can't remember if you
Your machine's on, right? Your machine's on, right? It won't log you out, it'll be all your assets. What? I think if your machine won't log you out, it'll be all your assets. We log in.
Connect to Miguel's.
I got mine.
If it doesn't use testing on Jerry's machine, no.
Here we go.
Does anybody want a drink or anything? It's not from Fit Wizards? No? You want a beer? Okay. Water? Also water. Okay. I said not from Fit Wizards, okay? I'll give you water.
You know there's not any water.
There's no bottled water.
I never reinstalled it. Wow, that's funny.
Yeah.
Careful now, sorry.
Is it a 10 crack commandment? Never get high on your own supply.
Impromptu at the bottom.
Jared.
No.
Please tell me, you know.
You missed it. Too late. We already ate
Pizza, pizza was good.
Kyle's getting bottled water from his car.
Oh, no.
Because I don't think we have any bottles anymore. It's all-
I'm more bottled water. Filtered water.
All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and and set this up and then explain it later. Explain it afterwards.
You could teach it.
Well, some people say that they're C-sharp.
Canadians are awesome. I'm Hill. I was Kelly yesterday.
It's a black hole.
That's what they call it. Do you remember Horizon? If you pass the Horizon, you know, it's open the door.
Yeah.
That was the first movie I ever saw. Was the black hole. I remember spending it. That was the coolest thing. Got a gate.
Is that the slider one?
Maybe.
No, the worst celebration I've ever had in my life, I got in New York.
Those little toggle switch. There was
I
resetting.
couldn't sleep because I was
75 channels total.
All right, guys. So all right. So what I've set up here, I've set up a simple test project here. It has a model, so it's separated into 3 projects. A model is where I'm going to keep all of my object. It has a repository that's going to speak to my database for me. It's just going to make my database calls. And I have a service there that's going to essentially it's going to do my work for me. It's going to make those calls. It's going to be dependent upon the repository and the student.
All right, somebody needs therapy.
That is a therapy.
So my first implementation of this, I'm gonna write it twice. The first time I'm gonna write it's gonna be in a legacy fashion. It's gonna need a lot of concrete implementations, so on and so forth, just so that we can apply our shims to test what we're trying to test. Yes, sir. I can't. Don't know how to do that. I'm using mouse.
100% you can.
Better? All right. So I'm gonna just hack through this real fast just for the sake of time. I had all this written for the sake of time, but yeah, but it didn't save. I was having some trouble when we were moving, and it didn't save to my Dropbox. It's okay. This is no pressure, right? With my boss right here.
This explains a lot of things.
Obviously not on my end.
I see a couple of compilation errors.
Huh?
You're missing a namespace, that's why you're not.
No, I have my namespace here.
No.
I have my namespace
It's
here.
in a different one.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna go ahead and do it. I'm not worried about it
Okay.
in that regard.
I like your style.
Huh?
I'm not worried about your style.
Okay, I'll do it. You guys wait, so you guys can kind of see what I'm doing. I'm gonna set up this student. Like I said, it's just a model that has some public properties. your first name, not a fist name. This is gonna be crazy. Especially on this little thing. How can you guys do work on this? Do work.
You just plug it in. Get wet.
I'm having trouble. Alright, so there's our student, a few properties. There's a certified repository as well. What about repository? Public. Return to student. I feel like this is going to take way longer than it should have. And I should not have wore this sweater. There's nothing like a ton of people staring at you in a sweater. True. Yeah. I think for my sake, at least I'm wearing pants. At least you guys are wearing pants. This is just gonna do something. I'm not gonna actually, this is my repository where I make my call to the database. I'm gonna pretend like I am and not. So I'm just gonna throw a not implementation. And just make it say, you know, I got some data from the database. Returned from database. And that's all that's gonna do. Make another one. That one gets my students by a particular ID, and this one is going to save my students that I give it. That's fine. This one's gonna save. And like I said, this is a legacy implementation. certainly some of the mundane things we do as programmers. Add references. So you guys know I have a little cheat sheet over here. Yeah, but I wanted to lost my train of thought. Let me dive back into this.
Usually someone's talking to me easier.
Yeah.
Are you still watching the video?
No. My code was
Hey man, that's not really.
my code was on my PC.
Dude, man, you got to go on a lot.
You didn't write it, you didn't have it.
Oh, nice. Even better. Now we're gonna see if you're actually really good.
I know, right?
Just trying to pull up a bridge in the code.
It helps if you dance a little bit, Jerry. Put off the sense.
Brian, you're like the worst audience ever.
Yeah, there.
It was pretty quiet until Brian showed up, so, you know. He may be helping Jerry.
The beer's down here.
Although we need to stop.
Nothing will ever be the time we used to get drunk. Then it really is.
Did you really?
Does anybody
need a beer? I was getting.
Not fine, we'll say.
Where's the beer sheet?
Okay, well, I was gonna get you one. I was gonna get one. See, Ryan, we got.
You invoice stuff for sure.
Are you doing something?
No, I was on YouTube.
Are you doing something?
I already did mine, number one.
Oh, I was gonna bring you on the spectrum, and then I realized that it was the purple barrel. Sounds like you're probably not gonna like it.
I'm hungry, but it's not hungry. If you like it, I'll keep it.
Yeah, I was
Oh, the
having a hand
shirt's
bit
coming
on.
off. They're gonna start flexing now. I gotta hear that.
Is that
You're wearing a soccer shirt.
Czech Republic?
As Valerie says, or people say, there's a lot of cats on this shirt.
And I know that he goes, you know, he's been.
Oh, yeah. Anything, shut the hell up.
You didn't know that.
It's here.
Okay. They said he should be here already.
He came to the back door, we directed him to the front door. But.
We had to unplug our PC. I think I would like to do.
That's a pizza here.
Must use what? Oh, yeah.
Well, we have pizza, while you're putting together a stove, if everybody wants to kind of help with themselves, pizza.
Yes.
Take a little pressure off there, and, twist my arm.
Whoa, appreciate it. And being associated with someone other than Tyler. Plates are on the side. Yeah.
Did you have
Our meeting was done. Because they really started on that side.
So we just walk through the place. So we don't keep this piece. That's well cut, so I'll take that one. Look at these lines.
Yeah.
If that would be. I want to get
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I can. Back of the line. I have two kids in high school.
Should go back in the session.
Hi, we're coming. I'm Brian. Okay. Trick?
Great.
Great. I know it's a little different than trick. Yeah, what? There you go.
When we turn these off.
Actually, there's two. They come to mind.
I said, what was it? I couldn't hear you.
One lady up there, I'm gonna let you stay away.
I'm going to grab you for something. I'm both searching.
You're gonna dance, you're gonna get the
So which way you want to start? This side?
Whichever side you want. Plates are over there.
You got. Dominoes.
Yeah.
Inside it is hot dogs and mustard.
Get there.
Are you kidding? Domino's has it? I don't know if they have it down here or they still have it, but in the past, like, years, they definitely had it in Canada, they definitely had it in England.
It's funny, that's such like, you're gonna
Yeah, a friend of mine had it. Well, I haven't had it, a friend of mine had it in Canada, and he said it was surprisingly really good.
Yeah, like,
I like hot dogs,
Audrey.
You call her, Audrey?
Marco.
Dial Audrey. Dial Audrey on the phone.
I thought this one looked good. You should have kept it on. The sweater looked good. You should have kept it on.
Oh, I was getting hot, man.
I know.
Yeah.
All the eyes on the back here.
Yeah.
Okay, but you did a good job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I've never been to one of these, but.
You cold?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
What do you code in?
Oh, no, I think, yeah, no, I don't know my husband.
Okay.
Yeah, I made a website like in 2000, that's pretty much it. Pretty much the
Mine's all online, so if anything's down.
No pressure, Jerry. We're just walking now. This is our new. This is how we do cooking. Wait, this is how we
invite strangers.
I'm gonna set up a computer and say, I want you to build Apex, and watch every second of it.
When I was working drum corps, they wouldn't tell us, but they would watch through every like floor, and then they would turn your tables for every ticket. And so like you'd be lining up after me, all right, this person, this person. And they tell you how many pushes you do.
Did you ever have any of those like battles where they have a drum line, like if you're that would be freaking awesome. Yeah, drum line.
Like a third party administrator.
And it started with a group of them.
Sorry,
And they came over and they wanted, they were pretty cool.
Their main program is in the
So long, they make the decorations so long, it's not like very
Yeah.
Right. The music major.
Yeah, graduated from
Oh my gosh, that's terrible.
How many of we have a huge budget. We have
Jerry has been sweating because he's had everybody watching him go. Sweat around. Somebody taking over your shoulder while you're trying to go. Not to mention
they were.
Now, that's rolling that out first year. I've written
wasn't really
Those big movies down.
This thing doesn't have.
Probably like a couple months ago, he was in some talk show, and they were like, "Can you still do knuckle buck?"
I don't think this has the fixed framework.
That didn't have a framework on it?
We saw those white hands in that movie.
You want to try my machine?
You may have to.
What version do you need?
Do you have premium, Visual 2012 premium?
I'm not sure. You're more welcome to remote on it.
Their real name is Esca, but it's Charlie Chuck. His dad's stage name.
Can you already beat my machine and use that? Can you already beat my machine and use
He was
that?
riding the coach.
I'm already came to Epson right now.
Oh,
Immediately within one day.
I think it worked out more than one.
Arguably the best.
But he did get to be Japanese more money by being that way.
Crazy
No worries.
Yeah.
I saw him on Who's Line today. And I think we were getting used to like all of these as well. And they just couldn't get used to anything. Like you just didn't understand any concept. They just didn't. Yeah, they kind of come back in. Very much misery now.
They still do that.
Yeah. No, it just came back like recently to do like new ones. Yeah, but yeah, the Duke video was great. Yeah, they got like the old guys set prepared because these are great.
I just never get like, hey, Jerry?
Yeah.
What are you doing, bud?
It's
like,
are you ready to?
Yeah, we're gonna have to divert, but this particular version of Visual Studio is not.
Oh, it doesn't have the framework?
Yeah, it doesn't give me the framework.
Well, I mean, even if you don't have working
Yeah,
code,
yeah.
you can speak
I'll speak to it.
With a presentation and talk through You want me to come gather everybody back up? Or?
Yeah.
All right, hey guys, Jerry's gonna start his presentation again. So, I mean, we can still eat and stuff, make yourself comfortable.
Oh, is he done? Are you done?
Things moving, we'll go to our places. Thanks. Maybe grab that last piece of pizza or so.
They're all.
No, go ahead.
Nope.
All right, guys. So one important thing that you need in order to use Microsoft Fix Framework is the Premiere version of Visual Studio. So you can't use Professional, you have to use Premiere and up, 2012 Premiere and up. This particular version of Visual Studio, it doesn't have the Fakes framework built in. That's why we're seeing this error here. I can't, it won't let me fake an object. Essentially what you would see here, there would be an additional event here that would allow me to add a fakes assembly. A fakes reference. And essentially what the fakes reference does is it takes that class that it's making a fake of, and in Microsoft, the framework itself creates a default implementation of that methods, getters and setters and methods. So it kind of, I guess, fakes it out. Within here, I would have access to, within this, I would have access to my, so this using statement, first and foremost, my shim has to be created in the context of that using statement. And what the using statement does in unison with that method there, it tells the compiler that, hey, we're going to be using this implementation of our concrete class. And remember, our concrete class in this particular one was the repository. In our services, we're going to test our service here, and we're going to test and make sure that the student that we got back from our database was the same student that was the student that we expected to get if we passed in a certain ID. And that's what our test was tentatively set up to do. But again, here is where I would make a call. I would make a call to instantiate. I will make a call to instantiate my my shimmed method, if you may, and it would look something like this: shim. So it would say shim find by ID, and then it would say int here, and that would be Microsoft's version of this particular method call within my repository class, my find by ID. And then within this, within my test, I could implement this here. myself. So in real life code, in production code rather, this will be making a call to the database. So it'll be passing that parameter to my database, and it would give me back. It would do some work, build a student, and give me back a student. And I can then from there, I would get that student from my service, whatever method call I was going to make to that service that I needed a student from. It's an additional layer of abstraction there, just so you guys can see it a little bit clearer. But nonetheless, unfortunately, I can't run a test and make it work for us here. This is one of those things that I guess you learn as you're presenting, is that you may be prepared, but technology may not. But excuse me?
I've been married.
Yeah, me too. So again, with that being said, then from within my using context is where I would, actually where I would make my assertion. So essentially I would assert that my student that I got back here, which is basically, this was going to be the data that I got. And then from there, I was going to build my student. This is my this would have been my actual student. He would have been a result of he would have been a result of my shimmed find by ID method call. So essentially that would look something like this. Repository dot. I'm just going to pass in a bogus value. And that's upset because it doesn't expect a student, it expects a database. I mean a data table. Okay, so now I'm just fudging this up even more. Nonetheless, I would I would get my resultant student. I would get my student from the repository, my shimmed repository call. I would have got my repository there. Let's just get out of this. We're gonna kill this right here. We're gonna go back to this just for the sake of time. I have a diagram that I could speak to. All right, so as we see there, I would have made my call to my shim. My shim would have replaced, using that within that using statement, it would replace my concrete dependency, and it would allow me to make a test to control what this dependency returned to me. I would have defined it right there within the context of my shim. So moving forward, because just for the sake of time, I'm going to continue to move forward. What we could have done is, I'm not too familiar with how to switch back and forth between the VPN. But what we would have done there, I would have refactored the code. We went in there, refactored the code, added a constructor to to my service, and I would have injected the dependency in from my test call. If that makes it, if that's clear to you at this moment. And then from there, I would have had control of my dependency. Then I can make a call to that database and return the data set that I wanted. So the data set that I implemented, the data table that I implemented, and that would have gave me back the student that I wanted. Right? So I isolated my test, because the only thing I wanted to test for whether or not when I made a call to the save, it gave me back the student that I expected to give me. With that being said, I would love if you guys could come to my desk. I could really give you a better understanding, maybe put get your eyes on some code to kind of see how this works, you know, when it's up and running. It's actually a very handy tool. Like I said, you know, instead of doing a lot of white box testing, you could actually, you know, close your things up into more of a black box test and implement your methods that way, as opposed to, for instance, I'm working on a clinical project now where, you know, in order to test the thing, I had to run the program, you know, run the actual website. And it can be a pain, you know, under certain conditions. But this is unit testing, and using a unit testing framework. In theory, like I said, if it's designed in such a way, I can use the unit testing framework to circumvent even having to run the program to test the functionality that I want. So again, in conclusion, the main things I wanted to touch on here, the objective I wanted to meet, we can meet it in time, but nonetheless, I hope that if anything, we can kind of get your brain spinning on what unit testing is. You know, maybe even change the way that we program with unit testing in mind, or inspired you to go out there and get a little bit more research on unit testing. You know, I'll be happy with that result. And any questions, any clarifying I could offer on any concepts? Yep. Well, thank you for your time.
All right, Tyler, you're up, buddy. Nose.
What?